Thank you so much, Professor Jansen. It's such an honor to welcome you to the We Need to Act podcast. You you have been a tremendous inspiration. Your entire career has been dedicated to improving education, which is connected to what we are trying to do with this podcast. Yet, in a previous interview, you mentioned that you originally wanted to become a biochemist. How did you end up pursuing a career in teaching instead?
Yeah, so in the apartheid years, if you were black, you couldn't get a state bursary for
Mhm.
things like medicine or biochemistry or engineering or any of that. You had to do what, again, the white government decided you must do, which was civil service kind of jobs, like a teacher, a policeman, a librarian in the public libraries, and that kind of thing. So I thought to myself, I would, get this money, study a BSc, and go and teach. And then once I earn my own money, I will then go back to biochemistry. The problem was that from the moment I set my foot in a classroom, I knew I was a teacher. I just knew that making complex things simple and seeing the joy of, high school students
Mhm.
as things click in their heads and they could make the connections between science and society and that kind of thing. I knew I wanted to do this. And so I thought, okay, if I chemistry is mainly bench work, I wanted to be with people, with young people. And to this day, even though I'm here at Stellenbosch University as a professor, I teach like 2, 3 times a week. I teach chemistry to high school kids.
Okay, so it was meant to be, not in that way, but in a different way. So you
People
decided to
here,
inspire people instead.
yeah, and people here in this culture tend to talk about, particularly in the religious community, they talked about teaching as a vocation, as calling. So somebody
Mhm.
called you from above and they told you you must teach. So I do feel that deep calling. I don't think of it as a job. I think of it as enormous privilege to teach people, teach young people.
Yeah, that holds like a huge responsibility as well, right? Being a teacher.
I feel
No?
joy,
Okay.
release, you connection. Feels like I'm aware, of course, of the fact that being
Mhm.
present in their lives is, particularly since I like teaching in high school, teaching poor kids, working class kids. I know for a fact that you are often the difference between, you know, poverty and hope, between misery and miracle, So I'm aware of that, but I don't ponder about it too much because I enjoy what I do. I see the difference in their lives. I always give more than usual. So because I haven't taught high school for a while, I take
Mhm.
8 hours to prepare a 50-minute lesson. That's how determined I are for the kids to understand and to succeed. You know, I feed them when I can. I take them to uh, science excursions every other week. That doesn't happen in South Africa in poor schools, in any school for that matter.
Okay.
But because we have privilege now, we have connections across the country, other parts of the world, and we're able to give these children what I didn't have, for example, which was to learn science by doing science as
Mhm.
opposed to learn it home.
Well, loving what you do is the first step. And you have been leading with empathy as well. And you broke barriers as the first colored rector of the University of the Free State. Well, in a system, as we know, shaped by apartheid and colonialism. We have been talking about a lot about colonialism here in this podcast. And looking back to, do you see that moment as both progress and a reminder of how far we still have to go?
Yeah, I know you probably don't have access to the debates and so on talking about colored identity, but I'm not colored, I'm black. If you must call me something. I know you do. We go. And so for me, black right, the black is a political identity, a consciousness. That said, I got mildly irritated over to free state or what does black mean of education at Victoria. All got irritated for I didn't want to be told that I was the first black. So, no, you're the best, but
Yes, right. It's true.
because once you said again, you don't need a black. But once you say, "Oh, you're the first," for a lot of South Africans, that means you just look me out as place. There was somebody better. I think you need accommodation. That at the days, the early years, following over, getting pissed off, the white university on there was some urgency
Mhm.
to open up, you know, because whiteness has the remarkable capacity to think that it is better than
Yeah.
anything that goes up with my kind of epidermis, and so on and so forth. So, yeah, so I never went in with an understanding that I was the first black. I just knew I was good at what I do, and I would raise the bar for white people in terms of academic standards. I had the privilege of studying at the best universities in the world. And so there wasn't a sense of apology or a sense of inferiority or a sense of being black. There was just this really strong determination to make sure that on the one hand, we raised the academic standards of these former white universities where I went, and on the other hand, to open it up so that all our
Mhm.
people could get access, particularly those who were left behind. But as you probably know from my work, I never made distinction in my love or in my devotion to the students or staff based on what they look like or needed to just make sure that whoever you were, I would
Mhm.
give myself 100% to your success. And I've done that consistently over the years.
It's really inspiring. We are all children of this earth. We shouldn't be labeled as white or black because we all belong there. Different trees, right? With different colors, as well as different humans. And as you well mentioned, it was not very good choice of the word colored. But it was just to mention that in this field of sustainability, we still have a lot to do. And I think this discussion around colonialism and colonial practices that still perdure and continue to exist, and we need to recognize that and open the dialogue to
Yeah.
to everyone around the world, especially the most affected, the most vulnerable and affected, and they have a say in this. And your academic foundation is in botany and zoology. A beautiful
Yeah.
entry point into understanding life systems. How that connection, early connection with the natural world, shaped your thinking about education, leadership, and society today.
Yeah, great question. So, I've always been torn between my love of the biological sciences or the sciences generally, natural sciences, and the humanities and the social sciences. And so you'll see in my example, some of the new books I put out is on the politics of knowledge in medicine. So, of course, I'm
Mhm.
not medically, but I'm fascinated by social science and medicine. I'm fascinated by how these things come together in
Mhm.
human endeavor and in human life. As you know, the problems of the world, including climate change, sustainability issues, don't come to us as disciplines. They come to
Mhm.
us as inter problems in which you need, people from many different angles. The pandemic was probably, some of the most fundamental errors in the early years of the pandemic was to put all your faith in immunologists and vaccinologists and infectious diseases experts, important as they were. But when you say social distancing, it's a sociological concept. It's not a medical, you know. And so, part of my work is on how to make sense of the world through these different lenses that the disciplines provide. And so, yeah, but I love the sound, the biologics, right?
Yeah, I also did my PhD around sustainability communication. And it was also with the goal of helping people translate complex systems into a more, I would say, tangible ideas for everyone to understand. And as you were saying, you chose also education to do the same. How do you see what is happening around the world nowadays, especially in Africa, regarding climate change and its impact? And the role of educators, how can education play a crucial role in this?
Yeah. So I how political leader in Africa, as in much of the West, the United States, and the Trump being a very good example, I don't think they have a sense of how serious this crisis is. The pandemic was seen as serious because you literally saw people dropping dead, you know. Or look at these horrific pictures of collapsing, of whole homes collapsing, you know, in a hurricane, or houses falling off the edge of a cliff, or the fires in California. And they wouldn't make the connection to climate change. You know, they wouldn't make it. They would just sort of see this as, oh, you know, there's a fire here or a melting ice cap there. They don't make these connections. And I think African leaders across our continent are so caught up. There's two problems. One is they're caught up in the immediacy of civil war, poverty, blah, blah, blah. Right. On the other hand, they also not very well educated, you know, to sense that a lot of these dilemmas in the public sphere have their roots in the way the world is changing, you know, in terms of climate and all that. So that the role of education is to instill in young people and older people a sense of the urgency. I just don't think you can teach geography today in high school without talking about climate change. I don't think you can teach water systems in or biological, you know, ecologies without teaching climate change. I don't think you should be teaching languages or poetry without reflections on writings about, you know, uh, uh, sustainability, and so on and so forth. So this is an educational task that a government, particularly those of us who work in public school systems, if a government doesn't stand, okay, the urgency and the importance, it won't make it into the curriculum. So they will put in sexy subjects, artificial intelligence, or, you know, the shiny stuff, you know. But they don't put in these issues. And it's, you know, it's like watching a slow moving trains moving towards each other, and we can see the clashes coming, you know. So unfortunately, you resolve these issues not in policy, but in politics. And this is where I think citizen action is probably the best way in which to address these issues. For example, through transnational organizations, you know, the United Nations and others, the World Bank, and making sure that a disproportionate amount of funding and expertise is put to work, you know. And then you have to just keep, you know, warning people, playing with fire quite literally, if you don't pay attention to these issues. But people think differently about stranded polar bears in Africa than they think.
Yeah. Do you still trust in those organizations that you mentioned? Because there is a growing distrust in governments and
No,
these
I don't.
international organizations to do the job.
Yeah, I know. I don't trust any of these organizations. To be honest, I still think I don't trust governments as well. Fellow South Africans will tell you. But
Mhm.
I also realize that they have our money. They have the money of the taxpayer. They have the given enough pressure, you know, to be able to change things. You know, in other words, when you have individual citizenship, citizen action, for example, so a lot of examples in South Africa, like Portugal, you cannot get to scale very quickly, very easily. All right. You can do really good stuff in Porto or in Cape Town or in so on, but it's a really different thing if you want to change the national consciousness of the national. And for that, you need politics, as I said, not simply good policy. And so I still believe in resistance. I still believe in, you know, taking to the streets. My way of doing action on education, for example, is to write about it, is to expose corruption. So I write a column every Thursday for 15 years and I put the issues out there. And so also the books that I write, you know, as you would have seen it, has sort of a moral and call to action, you know, as in we need to act. And so I use the power of the pen to deny brilliant persons, but that's only one of many, many uh, to this, I think, approaches to bringing to attention. But if you're simply knocking on the door of government and hoping they're going to see the light, it's not going to happen.
Yeah, true. And there is also the issue with the climate injustice, because, well, the countries that less contributed to the what is happening to the climate crisis are the ones that have been most affected by it. And actually, there is a push for them to move forward to embrace a green economy and sustainability in general. But actually, well, I believe that to be fair with them, not only should rich countries provide, because we have a moral and a responsibility towards those countries. And also, we should let those countries use the same resources we use before so they could reach the same level of development. What's your take into climate justice?
Yeah, no, I agree with all of that. And I've followed very closely the debates over the years from the time Al Gore, for example, was leading the charge, you know, on climate and so on. So I agree with all of that, but I also agree with looking at the global north within the global south. So if you look at South Africa, for example, it is a disproportionately huge polluter, you know,
Yeah.
and really well off in Southern Africa.
Mhm.
And, and and so it has a responsibility towards its neighbors, Botswana, Lesotho, you know, Zimbabwe, Mozambique, Namibia, etc., all around here, because we are a global north in a sense, you know,
Mm.
and we can make a huge difference, you know, if the same applies to India, for example, and Singapore, Malaysia, and Southeast Asia, and so on. So you also, in other words, the singular axis of the West is bad, and the rest of us are dependent on what they produce, not through
Mhm.
their major polluters, the US being a very good example. But we also have to look while we can at other geographic regions in which I think one could call on the BRICS nations, for example, to play a
Mhm.
much more active in their spheres of influence.
You are right. And changing a little bit of subject, you said that writing and thinking are forms of peace and power for you. And well, in a world of digital distraction, the rise of AI, political polarization, how do we protect critical thinking and nurture hope, especially among young people?
Yeah, you know, so when you think about the millions and millions of young people who come through universities every single day, you know, I'm not so sure that we as university leaders have given enough attention to how
Mhm.
we can play. For example, the institutional curriculum. How do you make universities? I wouldn't, for example, if I ran a university today, I would not, I would design a curriculum in which every student, when we were studying space science or social, every student would have to do 4 separate modules, one of which has to be on climate and sustainable in this conversation. Because it's the issue. I mean, there's absolutely no point in getting if you could be wiped out in the next 30, 40. So what is our responsibility as universities? And because your leadership in any society comes primarily with no one degree, okay, this is a very useful point. I'm not in the private sector, I'm not in the boardroom, I'm in the hospital. I'm huge leverage. And I did that, by the way, when I was in with Vice Chancellor, and that program still comes today. Jig it a little bit just given the urgencies of today is not as you know that government. And so I just don't think our university leaders think like that, you know.
How do we change our educational systems to adapt to what is going on? And what do you think will be the future of education, especially with the rise of AI, as I said before? That's something that really, I think I'm not afraid of AI because I think there is a lot of benefits that comes with AI, but afraid of what might become of people with the use of AI, because we are losing sight of what is really important and not stimulating creativity and critical thinking. And I think that's a really challenging thing for education in general.
Yeah, I agree with you. Look, again, if you want national scale, then you need a government that buys into what you and I are talking about. And there are governments that do this. The government of Kenya, for example, just on the AI issue is talking about, even though their GDP is much lower than that of South Africa. But they had political will, you see. And so you're going to the rural areas and students are there and getting access to high quality education materials they wouldn't have had if it wasn't for AI, you know. And so I like to, when I write reports for governments or for the private sector, to highlight where things are working. Otherwise, people go into some kind of depression. They say, "Oh, we must just throw up our hands," you know. The truth
Apathy.
is, apathy, indifference, but wherever
Yes.
you go in the world, you will find examples that are worth celebrating and sort of saying, "Well, if they can do it, why can't we do it?" You know. And again, you know, as a professor of education working in the social sciences, I mean, I don't have that much power. But writing, speaking, talking to you are very powerful ways in which one can get these messages out there. So I'm not only thinking of schools and universities as formal education institutions, but also the education institutions, you know, informal education that can all help, for example, to create awareness, consciousness of these issues.
How do you see the future of education?
Look, I think it will depend very much on the countries that will win, are the countries that can put in the light of developments in AI and in the light of the crises within climate and energy and sustainability and all of that. Countries that do well will do well. The problem with the issue that you put on the table is that it's not something that respects national borders. You know, it's not like you say, "Oh, we can stop the climate change." You know, and in California, not in Mexico, it doesn't work like that, as you know. And so this is the one area in which you need governments to work together, you know, to be able to slow down, you know, the pace of our demise. I'm optimistic about education. I have to be. I work in spaces in which I've seen people's lives changed overnight, you know, because of education. Again, whether that happens at the scale that I would like is a story that requires cooperation, which is still very stunning in the world at the moment.
True. And circling back to, well, sustainability and to decolonizing knowledge systems and centering lived experience. How can we reimagine education so that it empowers communities, honors indigenous and local knowledge, and fuels regenerative future? And how is the state of, I mean, Do you still feel, of course, I don't know very well the reality of South Africa, but you probably still feel these colonized systems impacting you. What could we do? How could we reimagine education to help?
Yeah, I'm not a big fan, as you might have heard, of privatization debates, in part
Oh,
because they don't discuss the way in which knowledge is actually produced. I don't
uh,
believe in for indigenous knowledge and use examples from 300 years ago because the world has changed. Okay.
yeah, right.
Of course, I'm partial towards resuscitating indigenous level. But when it comes to the world of science, I
Mm-hmm.
don't know what to do. With indigenous knowledge, what I'm looking for is ways in which you mentioned earlier social justice, the ways in which, and let's take a simple example of a very modern problem, which was the distribution of vaccines. It was very, very clear that in the global capitalist economy, with the power located mainly in the north, in which they sort of said, no, we're not going to just give you our vaccines, etc., which is short-sighted, precisely because people tend to move, viruses don't stay in one place.
True.
And humanity requires that we take care of the poorest of the poor, right?
Mm-hmm.
So those are real issues. But what I wanted to say is that the way in which knowledge is produced,
Mm-hmm.
not in sort of caves in the global south, and we produce knowledge together, right?
That's
Uh, uh, and I mean, the Omicron variant during the
mm-hmm.
pandemic was to South Africa and Botswana, not in the West. So,
Mm-hmm.
of course, balance of resources and infrastructures and scientific, but there's no real imbalance in expertise. We have outstanding people here in the global south, certainly in South Africa, in medical schools, in infectious diseases centers. How do we work together, you know, in ways that uh, the inequality of resources is not equated with the inequality of ideas? Okay, so given how knowledge is produced, I don't know what the point is of decolonization. You know, if it's to recognize many other knowledge systems, by all means, but show me what they are, and just making this a rhetorical cue, by Latin Americanists who get jobs in America, okay, and then tell us how we're being beaten up by the global north. I don't have time for that shit. I mean,
I totally.
work with where we are, I generate knowledge here with my teams. I have amazing teams, and I don't play second fiddle to anybody anywhere in the world. I don't say that arrogantly. I'm just saying, stop talking about this stuff. Just do it. But this notion of playing victim, oh my goodness me, poor us in the middle. So, no, 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 no. God gave us all the same brains, and use it.
Much.
Generate your own, put your ideas on the table. All my work is generated in the global south, okay?
Uh,
But it acts with benefits from, contributes to
uh-huh.
knowledge and, yeah, okay. I think Paulo Freire's work, for example, he's a Brazilian, right? Was Brazilian.
That's right.
He didn't just sit there and say, oh, I'm from the northeast of Brazil, look at how terrible I am.
Yeah, Paul Freire is a good example, and you are totally right. You are not the victims. Actually, you are producing a lot of things. You are doing great things, and you have like a very inspiring career and all the achievements to prove it. And congratulations on receiving the Division B Lifetime Achievement Award from the American Educational Research Association. Truly inspiring. And I have a question, a last question. Has been a very insightful conversation and open-eyed too. And it made me reflect about a lot of things, as you said. And in your book, We Need Act, you challenge us to move beyond reflection and take meaningful action. And for listeners who may feel overwhelmed or unsure where to begin, what is one concrete step they can take, or what message would you like to leave with our listeners so they can step up, move on, do the right thing, be
Yeah,
powerful,
that's
empowered?
an empowered. Yeah, it's a question I get a lot when I do work in poor communities, wealthy
Mm-hmm.
communities, and I went answer. I was in Sunday school in church many years ago. They used to teach us a song called "Brighten the Corner Where You Are." In other
Mm-hmm.
words, you're on a occasion where you have influence, where you can make a difference, start there. But don't get overwhelmed by the fact that the world is so large and that your resources are so limited, you know. And
Mm-hmm.
so I was in the poor community this morning, and we had built over 3 years a stunning early childhood education center that is linked directly to a primary school, so that these very poor children can get high quality education and step across a field and they get to grade one. And the people running that are people from their community, are people who said, this is where, in this poor community, I want to make a difference for 500 kids every year, you know, etc. Will that change the whole world? No. But will that get a whole lot of those children out of crime, out of poverty, out of absolutely? And so that's what I tell people. Citizenship action. If you're an accountant, you know, in an accounting firm, take kids who are disadvantaged and say, I'm going to give internships to 20 of you. So every school out there, I'm going to teach you how. Do it within the sphere in which you have influence, you know.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we got people, school I work with, a very troubled school. And I've been working there for 21 months now. Every single day, there are people coming to teach these children how to build community gardens, how the relationship between trees and climate, just in this poor working class school. But there's 1,352 kids there. Guess what? They're going to go out, you know, and have some kind of a multiplier effect with this new knowledge. So brighten the corner.
That's powerful. Message to leave listeners, and reminds me the notion of globalization. The challenges we face are global. We need to act local for us to have some impact, meaningful impact.
Correct.
Thank you so much for your time. It was a great honor to speak with you.